Economics is the study of the use of resources to produce and distribute goods and services. In this program, we shall see that it is possible to quantify or measure aspects of the economic process with measurements such as the well-known gross national product, or GNP, which is the total of all the goods and services produced by a country. In this way, large-scale economic comparisons can be made over time and geographically, in and among countries. The quantified entities of comparisons are called economic aggregates, or averages, and their study is called macroeconomics. Before considering the major economic aggregates studied in macroeconomics, let's take a look at averages in general. In a free market economy where price determines supply and demand, houses are continually being bought and sold. In a given area or neighborhood such as Pine Ridge, 10 houses were sold in 2 months. Here are the selling prices. When totaled, they equal $2,200,600. Divide this number by the number of houses, and the average selling price of a house in Pine Ridge was $220,060. But one of these houses was larger and more expensive, while the others were less costly. Because it was priced significantly higher than the others, the mansion-type house skewed the average up. To counter this effect, economists often use a different kind of average called a median. The median is a number which represents half of the home values on one side and half on the other. So the median price for the Pine Ridge neighborhood is $131,550. This is a more accurate representation of the selling prices of homes in Pine Ridge over the 2-month period. Now, let's compare over time what's been happening with home values in Pine Ridge. In the 30-year period from 1970 to the year 2000, we see that home prices have been steadily rising in Pine Ridge. Economists can examine possible reasons for the rise. It could be the result of inflation, a new business in the area, or perhaps the beauty of the location. Economists can also compare housing costs neighborhood by neighborhood. This is 12 points. The median cost here is $101,500, quite a bit lower than Pine Ridge. Here is a graph of selling prices for homes in 12 points during the same period. We can see that prices started by increasing, then, for some reason, around 1980, began to decline. In this case, it was the year a large manufacturing plant closed, eliminating many jobs in the area. Economists can also compare the median housing costs for cities. Here are some of the higher cost areas for housing in the United States for 1996. Here are some of the lower cost areas for the same year. This would be important information if you were planning to move and hope to buy a house. Now that we know something about averages in general, let's look at some of the most important macroeconomic averages, or aggregates. The sum of the production of goods and the supply of services in a given country is defined by the country's gross national product, or GNP. The direction and rate of change of a country's GNP is considered by economists to be the most important measure of how well a country is doing economically. Many factors can affect the gross national product. Here are 5 major ones. Population expansion or contraction, entrepreneurism, creation of new goods and services, trade, war, natural resources. Let's examine more closely how these factors affect the gross national product. Population. Population growth in a country can potentially drive up both GNP and per capita GNP. This is particularly true in industrialized countries. However, in more rural countries, population growth, while having a positive impact on GNP, can have a negative impact on the per capita GNP. For example, in agriculture, there is a limit on how much manual labor can increase production, so that eventually there is less food for each individual. However, by industrializing, using machines to increase production, per capita GNP can rise. Entrepreneurism. Certainly in the United States and other parts of the world, all the inventions associated with computers and other technological developments have fueled a huge expansion in the GNP. Trade. Prior to World War II, Japan was an isolated country. But in the post-war period, it opened up and became a huge trading partner for Western countries. As a consequence, its GNP made a large jump. War. Wars such as World War II destroyed much of Europe's economic infrastructure and drove down the GNP of the countries involved. The same is true of recent warring nations such as Iraq and some Central and Western African countries. However, for countries like the U.S. and much of Western Europe, which today supply military arms, war can have a positive effect on the GNP. Natural resources. The discovery of oil is a classic case of natural resources driving up the GNP of a region such as the Middle East. Similarly, in rainforests around the world, harvesting trees has had a positive impact on the GNP. It is possible to break down the GNP into more detailed aggregates called the origin of supply, which can give a better picture of a country's economy. They are manufacturing, construction, agriculture, fisheries, and natural resources, transportation, communications, and utilities, wholesale and retail, finance, insurance, and real estate, other services.
From all indications, he still feels pretty good.
Other services would include occupations like veterinarians, doctors, dentists, and lawyers. Tourism is another example. In some countries, tourism is the main form of economic activity. Let's now look at some other aggregates. Gross domestic product, aggregate demand, unemployment, inflation and deflation. Gross domestic product. While the GNP includes the business done by a country's companies overseas, it excludes business done by foreign countries within its own boundaries. For the gross domestic product, or GDP, the opposite is true. For example, Neoplan is a major manufacturer of buses in the United States, but it is owned by a German company. Therefore, its economic activity is not included in the GNP of the U.S., but it is included in the GDP. Conversely, when McDonald's opens a restaurant in Germany, the sales are included in America's GNP, but not in its GDP. Therefore, many economists now favor GDP as a more accurate measure of the economic activity of a country. Aggregate demand. Most adults work and receive a yearly salary. How much of that salary do they spend into the economy through the purchase of food, homes, cars, and other goods and services? The percentage they spend is called the aggregate demand. What else could they do with their income? They could save it in a bank or buy stocks, among other things. An important economic law states that as income rises, aggregate demand rises less quickly. Or in less industrialized countries where income is low, aggregate demand is high. Unemployment. This is the percentage of workers in the country, state, or city who are not at work, or we could say do not have jobs. For many, lack of skills or education is an impediment to finding jobs. In some cases, businesses can fail and people may lose their jobs. However, there have been times when economic failure was more widespread. Due in part to an environmental phenomenon called the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, the United States experienced massive unemployment, reaching 25%. This was called a depression. A less severe economic downturn is called a recession. This is a picture of unemployment in the United States for much of the 20th century. Note the high unemployment during the Depression of the 1930s. Unemployment dropped rapidly during World War II, leveling off at around 7%. Inflation and deflation. The final economic aggregate we will look at is the price of goods and services, and more interestingly, the change of these prices over time. If economists analyze the price changes over time, like the cost of gasoline, meat, and everything else we buy, some prices will go up and some will go down. On a month-by-month or year-by-year comparison, the change in the overall price of goods and services will either be positive or negative. If the number is positive, it's called inflation. If negative, it is deflation. The amount of change is called the rate of inflation or deflation. As a rule, prices in the United States and other industrialized countries have gone up over the last 50 years. While most items have gone up in price, there are notable exceptions. For example, the cost of personal computers has dramatically decreased since their introduction as the result of advances in technology. Now that we have seen some of the most important aggregates like GNP, GDP, unemployment, and inflation, let's look at some of the tools economists and governments have used in their attempts to control and manipulate economic aggregates. One of the most powerful tools is called monetary policy. Since money, all the paper and coins used in a country, is a human invention, it is something that can be controlled. At one time, the value of money equaled the actual worth of the material it was made from, as with gold and silver coins. Then, as the use of paper money increased, governments held precious metals like gold in reserve, equal to the value of the paper money in circulation. This is called the gold standard. However, in the 1930s, economists understood that a gold or silver standard was not necessary. All that was needed was enough money to cover economic transactions, and a belief by the people that the money was good. Remember, money has always been a human construct. It was found that during the American Depression of the 1930s, the money supply, the amount of money, coin, and paper that a government puts into circulation, has a strong impact on such economic aggregates as inflation and unemployment. Some economists believe that the single act of making more money available to flow into the economy can stimulate new economic activity, such as housing development and consumer spending. Also, the central bank, the institution in a country that decides monetary policy, can affect the variables of an economy by setting interest rates on short-term notes. Banks, in turn, follow this pattern of setting interest rates for the money they loan to businesses and citizens to finance the purchase of things like new buildings, equipment, cars, and houses.
How much are you looking to borrow?
60,000.
60,000. Okay.
I'd like to.
Here we can see the relationship between the interest rates, inflation, and unemployment. Notice how they all move together. Setting interest rates is considered by many economists to be the primary way to control inflation and the rate of the GNP. Another tool for controlling and manipulating economic aggregates is called fiscal policy. It is the amount of money a government takes in and spends, called the federal budget. Through most of its history, the U.S. government usually had a balanced budget, or was in surplus. That is, the amount of money it spent on things like the military, government buildings, and federal employees' salaries was equal to or less than the amount of taxes it took in. But during the Great Depression, and from the 1970s to the present, the government has spent much more than it took in. This had the effect of greatly expanding economic activity, hence affecting all the major economic aggregates. This is called deficit spending, and there is a great debate in countries concerning the consequences of deficits versus surplus budgets. Most economists believe a certain amount of deficit spending for building infrastructure like roads, transportation in general, and education is acceptable to create a positive future, especially if the debt is small in relation to the GNP. Another way of impacting economic aggregates is by shifting businesses from the private sector to the public sector, or vice versa. A final way of affecting economic aggregates is through trade policy. Trade between countries affects employment and the value of the currency of a country. For instance, as shown earlier, after World War II, Japan, through trade, became a huge independent power, creating high employment and a large GNP. So, we have seen that there are many economic aggregates or averages that measure economic activity and behavior, and they can show how a city, a region, or a country is doing economically. These aggregates, measured over time, like employment or inflation rates, can be predictors of the future. A future which can be manipulated to some degree by monetary and fiscal policy of governments.